Welcome back, everyone. Having a conversation today on the epic fantasy genre of literature. Jackie is back on the channel. We actually did a buddy read recently on an epic fantasy novel, Words of Radiance by Brandon Sanderson, which is one of the best novels I've ever read. And we're going to talk about everything epic fantasy here. So, Jackie, for those that haven't seen you on the show before, and guys, leave us a comment if you want us to bring anything specific up. Jackie, why don't you tell us maybe a little bit about what you like to read to familiarize the audience with your reading tastes?
So I'm Jackie Ragnarovna. My channel is Me, My Skirt, and I, and it focuses mostly on fantasy, epic fantasy books, which I just got back into after a long reading hiatus. Before then, it was Jane Austen mostly and chick lit, but I've come back into epic fantasy and I'm really enjoying it and whatever else is available.
Yeah, and I'll put the link for your channel down in the description below for everyone. If you like epic fantasy, you'll want to check her analyses out of some good books that she's read. Let's start this out here with a question. I've got a list of questions that are going to get us talking here. Jackie, what is your favorite epic fantasy series and why?
So I feel like I can only judge the series that I've finished, which consists of right now Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter. And that's my phone going off that I'm now hung up on. Okay. Sorry about that. With of those two series that I've actually finished, it had to be Lord of the Rings, just because it's a much fuller world and more. I love well thought out stories. Like Harry Potter was fun, but it's got like just too much whimsy and randomness to be truly great. Though I'm like all caught up with the Stormlight Archive, and I think I'm up on A Song of Ice and Fire. It's been a while since I've read those, but
yeah. Go ahead.
But I can't judge them yet because they haven't been finished. So, and yeah, I just love Lord of the Rings because it is the quintessential epic fantasy, and it just has really great stories and wonderful moments, though it is slogged down by an overly description of trees.
So. You know, I really liked the trees in the Lord of the Rings, particularly. I liked the Ents because I just finished that book for the first time in my life at the age of 36. I decided to read the Lord of the Rings, and I thought it was going to be like this painfully boring read that I would appreciate it for whatever reason afterward, but I was quite surprised at how much I enjoyed that book. You know, I had never seen the movies before I picked up the novel, so perhaps that had something to do with how much I enjoyed it. I just wanted to know what that epic story was all about. And I had a loose idea of what it was about, Frodo taking the ring to Mordor, but I didn't know much more than that. You know, the Song of Ice and Fire series is one that I need to finish. And I seem to have this problem sometimes with epic fantasy. Maybe you've experienced this, but I will pick up the first book in an epic series and I'll enjoy it. Like with the Game of Thrones, I did it. I thought it was a great opening introduction novel for that series. I did it with the first book in the Malazan Book of the Fallen series, Gardens of the Moon. Thought it was a fantastic story. However, it seems for some reason when I get into that second volume, it can seem to me that like the same ideas are rolling over into the second book that were in the first book, and it can be kind of like a retelling of the first book, even if there is an objective that's continuing to be worked toward. It can seem like a rehash. And this is what I thought about the second Harry Potter book. It seemed like the second book was like a retelling of the first book with the same main character back at Hogwarts again, taking on the same enemy for the second year in a row. Do you ever experience that where you like you can get into something and then you burn out on it, or are you someone that persists and loves everything that you take on?
I have to say that up until very recently, I was like notorious for burning out on series. Like I loved Aragon. Um, and I read the first book and I read the second book and I wrote fan fiction. There is still fan fiction on fanfiction.net by me about Aragon. And I think I've changed my pen name on there to match. Anyway, you can find me on there. But I never read the third and fourth book, just like it was so long between. It's more like the weight and the excitement factor of specifically in Aragon. Like they say several times that like you're going to like they tell Aragon that you're going to survive, but you're going to go on a long journey at the end of it. I'm like, okay, well, that doesn't sound like a particularly great way to end the story, but that's apparently where we're going with this. And I'm not really invested in that ending. And then also I was a huge Murtagh fangirl, and like what Paolini did with Murtagh at the end of book 2 was like, I was not okay with that. Like he was just not cool anymore and was into whiny territory. So like that's probably the biggest example of a series that started with such passion and then just burnt out so hard. Yeah. And like probably if it weren't for COVID and like becoming aware of like people's excitement for series like The Wheel of Time, I would have burned out. Like as I'm working through them, I'm like, I can like point at pages like I would have burned out here, I would have given up here, but like knowing that it gets better gives me the strength to go on.
Yeah, that can be true. You know, when you finish an epic series, and I've only ever finished one myself, I've completed one epic fantasy series, you get this sense that it's like a reading experience that's unlike anything else. It's even beyond what you would experience with a trilogy, in my opinion, because it's just this huge amount of background and depth and like thousands of pages about different places on a map, and you know, it's like this. It's a bigger experience than if you like just read a novel on its own, and to get that enjoyment and that experience, I can sometimes see that I do want to persist on beyond that second book or whatever to, you know, get on with it. But I don't know what to do about this problem of mine. I think that the problem might be this, is when I picked up a Game of Thrones, for example, I thought the book was great. I enjoyed it more than I expected to. And I immediately went into the second book. I was all gung-ho about another 1,000 pages worth of that plot, and I kind of ran out. So not long ago, I kind of implemented this idea that when I pick up a series, if I love that first book, that I'm not going to immediately go into the second book, that I want to take breaks in between what I'm reading, because I don't want to burn out on an epic story like Lord of the Rings. Song of Ice and Fire. Now I've got to go back and read book 1 again to start the whole damn thing over. Got to do it with the Malazan series as well. But what do you know about Stephen King? Have you ever read Stephen King?
I have not. Like, I heard so much about him, but my instinct is that he's horror.
Yeah.
And that with the exception of the anime series Baccano, I don't like horror. I'm not even sure if like the series counts as horror, even though like it's put in horror on like Crunchyroll. But anyway, and so thinking of him with fantasy is very strange for me.
Yeah, we'll come back to King. I want to read a comment here. I'm not really a fantasy reader, but some years back I was given Neil Gaiman's American Gods, which I actually have a paperback right here, and started reading it. To be nice to the person who gave it to me. I was immediately caught up in the book. Just as a side note here, have you ever read Neil Gaiman?
I've picked up American Gods, but like it was like I picked it up in my college's library and then got sidetracked, and like that is literally as far as it's gotten in my hands.
You know, I don't think Neil Gaiman has an epic fantasy series. I know that he has this graphic novel series. I think he might even have more than one that are kind of epic in stature, where it's this lengthy comic book series. I used to frown on graphic novels until I actually read one. And I realized like there can be a lot of text in those things. You know, it can take 2-3 hours to finish one of those. But let's go back to Stephen King. It's a common misconception that Stephen King only writes horror. In fact, only around 60% of the nearly 100 books that he's written are technically categorized as horror. The Dark Tower series is not horror. Of course, there are some horrific elements in it, as there usually are in an epic fantasy series. There's some dark part of the tale, but this one is about a gunslinger who is on a quest for the Dark Tower, and he doesn't know why he has to get there, but he just knows that he needs to get to this tower. It's a lifelong quest ever since he was young. And this can kind of be seen in the Lord of the Rings, right? In the Gunslinger, we have our quartet, which would be our fellowship of people that come together by the end of the second book to pursue that tower and whatever it is that's important about the tower. But this is a low-end epic fantasy story. It's my favorite story of all time. It's what really has gotten me into trying to go beyond that, to get a similar reading experience by reading other epic fantasy series. But you know, I highly recommend this one. I'm not going to get stuck on Stephen King in this video, but I would recommend you try it. It's a lovely tale. But yeah, I love Stephen King's The Gunslinger. We'll come back to that. But tell me, which epic fantasy book that you've read, the second question on our list, which epic fantasy book that you've read is the absolute best one?
Oh, gee. Because
I'll tell you what mine is. I think that The Drawing of the Three by Stephen King is possibly my favorite. It's a very imaginative book. But I also really liked The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. That was a whole new experience for me in epic fantasy. I would say just as far as the quality of the writing itself, that perhaps Brandon Sanderson is the best at that high-end epic fantasy. In fact, I know he is. And I would say that my favorite high-end epic fantasy story would be The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. And if I had to give my favorite on a lower end, you know, when we're talking about epic fantasy, when we talk about high-end, we're talking about wizards, you know, mages and knights and castles and magic and all this stuff in a fantasy landscape that has nothing to do with our world. There's usually a map in the book with those epic high-end fantasy. And the low-end ones generally have something to do with our world here. There might be some magic in there and a wizard or two, but it's more based in our world. And I would say The Drawing of the Three is probably my favorite low-end fantasy book in and of itself. But let me turn the question back to you. Which one that you've read has been the most enjoyable?
Well, I was going to say The Way of Kings as a book, because like The Lord of the Rings works as a series, as a full, complete thing. Yeah. But like there's not really like a single part of like, oh, I like there's like things I like in The Fellowship, things I like in Two Towers, things I like in Return of the King, whereas like there's not a part of The Way of Kings that I dislike.
Yeah.
Like it, and same with Brandon Sanderson in Stormlight Archives later books, where there are like scenes that like if I'm feeling down, like there is a chapter in Words of Radiance that I go to. Like I have a headache, I will read this chapter. But like there are parts of that book that make me want to like just make me so angry and upset, and I do not like them. Whereas with The Way of Kings, it's like, yes, there are sad parts, and yes, there are parts that like make me angry, but they make me angry in a way that I am still enjoying the book. And so there's like no part of it that I dislike, and as a whole, I have to say that is my favorite book.
Yeah. Yeah, that is an incredible book, The Way of Kings. We have a couple of comments. Maria wants to know, what fantasy books would you recommend to read? And I'm going to go with The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. And I would also recommend, of course, the Dark Tower series by Stephen King, the Gunslinger. You want to answer her question? What would you recommend to her? Presumably someone who probably hasn't read that many.
If you're starting out, I wouldn't recommend The Way of Kings, actually. It is a big book that you have to like get like a third of the way through before anything starts making sense.
Yeah, that is true.
Whereas like Elantris is also by Brandon Sanderson, and that's probably like my favorite standalone. Well, it's like right after I love that book. And if you like Elantris, then you'll like the Stormlight Archive, because the Stormlight Archive is all the ideas that are in Elantris, but cranked up to 11.
Yeah.
And so that's a great way to like get into Brandon's style, although he gets better in the Stormlight Archive. His style, like what it's talking about, and like what the feel of this place is. Going into how they're related would spoil too much of like the book.
Yeah.
But also just real low end, The Hobbit, and The Horse and His Boy, which is a Chronicle of Narnia by C.S. Lewis.
Mm-hmm.
Which doesn't get talked about as much because like there's the iconic Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe. But The Horse and His Boy is like C.S. Lewis decided to write his own fan fiction for his own series. And yes, there's some of like the hoity-toity British pastor sort of vibe that he has with his stories. But there's also just a lot of fun, which you don't really, which I didn't really associate with most of the Narnia books. But this one has talking horses and midnight escapes, and it's just a real, like, I could probably read it in like 2 hours, so it's a good place to start as well.
You know, I recently picked up the Chronicles of Narnia, only because I know that I did a video for my YouTube channel here on the top 10 best-selling books of all time, and The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit came up into that, and the Chronicles of Narnia came into that as well. So I was reading to make that video, and I found that Tolkien and C.S. Lewis were good friends when they were both writing their fantasy epic, Lord of the Rings for Tolkien and Chronicles of Narnia for C.S. Lewis. And they were like reading one another's story and everything. I just thought that that was really interesting, that two authors were friends writing these two separate stories that ended up being like two of the absolute most successful stories of all time. But I just want to read it basically because I've got this project that I'm doing with Epic Fantasy. Did a video on it recently where I saw, when I picked up the first book in the Wheel of Time series, where there's this scene very early on in the Wheel of Time, book 1, The Eye of the World. Our protagonist, Rand, and maybe his father, it's been a while, I can't remember, but they're going through the woods and they're traveling on this path through the woods, and they come to realize that something is wrong. And it turns out there are these dark hooded riders that are coming up behind them. And I realized that that entire scene was inspired by the exact same thing that happens in The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien. And I like appreciated that a lot. So it made me want to like go back and read a lot of those early stories so that when I read something like the Malazan Book of the Fallen or whatever, I can catch these things where I say, oh, this was inspired by this and that was inspired by that. I really like picking that stuff out, but I've got to read the Chronicles of Narnia so I can see where those eggs are dropped in other people's works. But yeah. Did you have something you wanted to say there? If
you want to find Easter eggs, especially like C.S. Lewis Easter eggs, especially in Brandon Sanderson's work, I would highly recommend Till We Have Faces. It is also by C.S. Lewis. It's not like an epic fantasy in the way that you're thinking of, because it's like historically set in a kingdom that is north of Greece, but there are gods that are
Yeah.
characters. The West Wind is a character. The god who is basically Eros is a character, as is Aphrodite. And it is very interesting, especially when you reach like that. If you read that book and then read like Rhythm of War, there are
Mhm.
some very interesting
Ah.
parallels
Yeah.
that I think more people should be aware of. So there's my public service announcement. Like, read
Yeah.
this book.
Yeah.
And, and then watch
Go
a
ahead.
review of it. I reviewed that book for my channel, thinking it was just would be a random one-off thing, and then like 2 weeks later, Rhythm of War came out, and I was like, oh gosh.
Yeah. It is a lot of fun to see those literary inspirations that come through. Of course, entire series have been basically a ripoff of the Lord of the Rings. The Shannara series I've heard is very much like that. But even in the Dark Tower series, I caught quite a few things as I was reading that come from, other sources. Oh, for example, minor spoiler alert on the Dark Tower series, very minor. Stephen King pays homage to J.K. Rowling and Harry Potter in his Dark Tower series. There are a part or two and a couple of the books in the series where something specifically from that Potter world comes into play. A weapon in one of the books and something else, I think, in another one. But it was really neat to see that happen. But yeah, let me read a couple of these comments here. Maria says she wants to read The Never-Ending Story, and that's something that I want to read. I know that story is about a boy that starts reading a book and he comes to realize that he has something going on with what's happening in the book. Like he's a part of the damn thing. I remember the movie loosely when I was a kid, but I haven't read it as an adult. It's been so long that I want to go back and read that. Have you heard of that story? I'm sure that you have, but
I've heard of it. I know there's a really catchy theme song, and that's all I know about it.
This is crazy, this Never-Ending Story. It's a fantasy story, obviously. This is how it goes, briefly, and we'll move on from it. But this boy decides to skip school one day, and he might even be at the school, but he gets a book and he goes up and hides somewhere to just read for the day. And while he's reading this book, it's a fairy tale, and he comes to realize, like, it's him that's being talked about in the plot. And it takes him a while to realize this, and all of a sudden this world is like exposed where he has to like do stuff to help them in the book and everything. It's just this craziest damn thing, this fantasy landscape. It's a really interesting thing. Andrew mentions Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which is a 1,000-page book. Have you heard of that one?
I haven't. I'm sorry, Andrew.
I know that it's this really big, like standalone book. I think I'm not sure what it's about, but I know that it's a fantasy. It's probably not what we're thinking. Epic fantasy. Marlene asked in the comments, is Stephen King considered fantasy? And the answer to that question is yes, he is. Stephen King writes romance. He writes children's books. He writes young adult fiction. He writes horror and police detective thrillers and dramas like The Green Mile or Shawshank Redemption. He writes epic fantasy on the low end. He writes just regular ass fantasy books with fairy tale type stuff. He even writes a Western. So he's like all over the damn place. And he is definitely the author of an epic fantasy series, The Dark Tower. So I highly recommend that you guys check that out. Let me ask you this one, Jackie. Who is your favorite epic fantasy author? And then we'll come back to the rest of the comments.
I mean, I hate to sound like a broken record, but it's still Sanderson. Like, I love Tolkien's ideas and his like. Tolkien has the ideas for great stories, but he's not a good storyteller for me. Like, it took me 3 tries to get through Lord of the Rings because like I just couldn't stand the way he wrote. And Lewis was just so preachy. Rowling's kind of all over the place. And then there are things I like about Robert Jordan that like I find that are his unique talents.
Mhm.
But there are also things about him that drive me crazy. Like he's very good at writing rednecks, but they're like you're 5 books into the series now, and everyone is still acting like a redneck, and like they're completely shocked that they have mystical powers, even though they've been told this for like 5 books now. So
Yeah.
whereas I think that Sanderson has the boon of learning from all these authors and saying, I'm not going to
Yes.
be like Tolkien and have my characters talk like real people, but I'm not going to be like Robert Jordan, and I'm going to level them up so that we're not always stuck at the same place for so many books.
Yeah. Yeah, Brandon Sanderson is a great choice. Were you finished with your thought there? I don't want to cut you off.
No, I'm done.
Brandon Sanderson is a great choice because, for example, I mentioned earlier that I've had trouble getting through the second book in an epic fantasy series. I read the first 1,000-pager. I get into the second 1,000-pager, and boy, that story's really got to get good to keep me going with that same cast in the same place with similar problems happening. And I thought that I was not going to get through this novel right here because of that. The second book in the Stormlight Archive, this is the one we read together. I expected epic fantasy burnout when I read this book. It's such a massive novel. It's 1,300 plus pages, 400,000 words, I think. And for whatever reason, this book really kept me all the way through. I was into this. I managed to get to the first 2 books in a series, totally engrossed the whole time. Sanderson does seem as though, by my limited understanding, is probably the best epic fantasy writer in the high-end scale that's ever done it. You see, I can only imagine, because his big break was finishing Robert Jordan's The Wheel of Time series. Boy, did he get a literary break when they called him and asked him to do that, because he was a fan of the series. You know, he has a YouTube channel, Brandon Sanderson does, drops a video like every day. It's really personal he is with his fans, but he must have had to really have undertaken a study to finish that thing. And everybody loves the way he finished it, to the best of my knowledge. So that was probably a huge learning experience for him. And it seems like many people would say that he's basically the climax of epic fantasy, that he writes it better than anyone ever has. You know, everything evolves, and literary genres are no different. They get better, it seems, over time. And it seems like Brandon Sanderson has taken it to the next level with these huge ass 1,000+ page books. Yeah. Anything more you want to say about Sanderson?
He just balances characterization, plot development, magic system, like all the different parts. I mean, like maybe there's like a kid, like there's probably authors that I'm like, I like their characterization better, or like this better from other authors, but like Brandon does everything at least well, and some things he does great, if not stupendous.
He is really good. And something that's interesting about his works, he does something similar to what Stephen King does. You see, Stephen King's The Dark Tower is his magnum opus. It's the centerpiece of everything that he's ever done. If you didn't know better, you might think It or The Stand was his centerpiece, but King has a lot of other books that play a role in this series, some in a very intimate, influential way. They're all about the Dark Tower series, and some in a more minor way. And Sanderson does that same thing, where like his Mistborn trilogy actually has some kind of influence on his Stormlight Archive. And there's all this background with all these different works and novellas and short stories that play a part in these other stories. And I just like a sophisticated web of story like that. Perhaps that's one reason why I like Stephen King and Sanderson so much, is because there's just so much there to appreciate. It's like you got to read them all to fully understand any individual piece of the overall whole. To answer that same question, I would say probably Stephen King's my favorite author. You know, you mentioned character development, and most people would agree, probably, even if they weren't his biggest fan, that he's really great with characters. Seems like novel writers, for some reason, have this very intuitive understanding of human nature and psychology and philosophy and everything. And I think Stephen King's just spot on with his characterization. But I would have to agree with you. As far as fantasy goes, I'm kind of split between King and Sanderson. Here's the next question. Do you prefer something like a trilogy or a 10+ book series? What do you prefer when it comes to fantasy reading?
Well, up till very recently, it would have been the trilogy, just because like I can commit to a trilogy, like, or
Yeah.
even maybe up to like a 4-book one, whereas had just like I've been so burnt out over A Song of Ice and Fire, Aragon. Even when I tried like Kingkiller Chronicle, like that one, I thought I only had to get through 3 books, and then like after the first one, I was like, well, maybe I'll finish this eventually. But it's so like if I just see that off of a shelf, like I started Sanderson with Mistborn because it was just a trilogy that was already completed, and I could do that. And like I don't think, although ironically, like I didn't like the way Mistborn ended, and it took Elantris to get me back into Sanderson. But like generally, if I see like 10 books on a shelf, my first thought is, that's a lot of books. But now that I've like made significant headway into these series, I'm starting to get more excited about, it's a long series. I might like it.
Now, I think that you recently said something that you were now into the Wheel of Time series. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm working through that. I'm on the 5th book.
Damn. Okay, you're a good ways into it now. What do you think about that, just generally? I'm curious, because I'll tell you what, I picked up the first book, The Wheel of Time, in The Eye of the World in the Wheel of Time series, and I stopped halfway through. I'm not. It's been a while, and I am going to reread it. I want to read that whole series. I'm going to go back to it. But I remember feeling that like there just wasn't. It didn't seem like it was really going anywhere in a hurry, and I just put it down. I'm just curious, what do you think of The Wheel of Time now that you're 5 books in? Is it just overwhelmingly awesome, or how's it going for you?
Like, this is one of those series that like I made a commitment that I was going to read each book a month for the next, I guess, 1.5 years of my life.
Right.
And so I made that commitment, and was aware of like, if you was aware of like the great fan of the fandom and like the excitement for this series, as well as like the acknowledgement that the first 2 books are kind of odd, and then the 3rd and 4th book are really great, and then it ends great, is like the promise that I was given by like the fandom at large. So it's like, yes, the first book is slow and odd and doesn't seem to go anywhere. That is completely true. And then like I was telling my buddy reader who just finished the 3rd book that I'm like, yeah, if these books had come out, like if I was reading these books as they were originally being released, I probably would have like dropped after the 2nd book, just because it has a lot of the problems that you have with 2nd books, of it's like rehash of the first, but slightly different. And Jordan, like, he just goes off on, he's taking chances, he's making mistakes, he's getting messy. And so that's like one of the benefits of the series, is that he's doing that. Also, The Wheel of Time is like the quintessential farm boy story that no one wants to write anymore, because it was done in The Wheel of Time. It was done very well in The Wheel of Time. So I almost like it because of that, because like, where else am I going to get the farm boy becomes savior of the world story, if not here? But that can still be a turnoff to other people who are like, I've been told that farm boy stories are dumb, so I'm not going to like it.
Oh, here it is. Here it is. I'll tell you where you can get more Farm Boy takes on the world. You can get it in the Sword of Truth series by Terry Goodkind. Are you familiar with the Sword of Truth series? This is a really polarizing one.
Is that the one that was turned into Legend of the Seeker, or is that a different one?
That might be true. I've only read 2 books in this series. So I honestly, I'm not really knowledgeable about this, and it's been some years now since I read Wizard's First Rule. But the only thing I can really tell you about it, it is the Farm Boy takes on the world type thing. Where were we now? Oh, yeah, we were talking about the series and the fact that you prefer a really lengthy series. You know, as much as I love the Dark Tower series is long enough to be an epic fantasy. Let's actually back up here. What is it that you consider an epic fantasy? I'll tell you what it seems to be to me. When I think an epic fantasy story, it can be high end or low end, but it needs to be one long story with maybe an occasional side novel or whatever, but one long story that plays out over like at least 4 or 5 books, and generally speaking would be even longer. Like, it's hard for me to call a trilogy an epic fantasy story, even though the genre is epic with the sword and sorcery type jobber. It seems to me epic more refers to stature and scope and background and depth than it does to the specifics of the plot. See, it would be kind of even hard for me to call The Lord of the Rings an epic fantasy story, because it's not like a long enough, rigorous enough tale to be something like, the Stormlight Archive or the Wheel of Time. The Wheel of Time is the quintessential epic fantasy story in my view. But what is it that you consider an epic fantasy? I'm just curious.
I think that trilogies count. If only because, like, by definition, I always think Lord of the Rings is epic fantasy, and Lord of the Rings is a trilogy. Therefore, trilogies count. But Lord of the Rings also has, like, the Silmarillion backing it up as, like, if you want to get the world building, here's a lot.
Yeah, that is true.
Even though plus the Silmarillion, there may be as long as, like, the first 2 books of the Stormlight Archive. But, like, it's what Tolkien is able to do, and what Sanderson is able to do, is create a world, put the entire world in peril, and make you care about that world, and then I save it, hopefully, or maybe not. We don't know with Stormlight Archive yet, but basically put, like, on some level you should feel like you're reading, like, World War II with the different fronts and the battle lines and that kind of scale of story. And if you can do it in a trilogy, then all the more power to you. If it takes you 10 books, great. I'll be here for the 10 books. And so, yeah, like the maps, the world building, I love reading, I liked reading the maps of Lord of the Rings long before I liked actually reading the books. I still probably prefer them, just to look at those and be like, oh, that's so cool. As opposed to, like, fantasy that's set more in if it's just like a kingdom that's still, like, in-depth fantasy, but I'm not going to call it, like, epic fantasy.
It would probably be, I could probably debate with myself in a kind of philosophical way where the dividing line would be, as far as, like, that epic journey I took in the Dark Tower, where it was just such a long literary experience. I don't know where the dividing line would be that kind of separates that epic stature. I think the Dark Tower is well over 1 million words. I don't know. It's just kind of hard saying. Let me ask you this. What do you know about the Malazan Book of the Fallen? And I know it's not a lot, but I'm just curious. Is this something that's on your radar right now, or
It's definitely on my radar because like it's often brought up as like, oh, if you like Sanderson, you'll like Malazan.
yeah,
But I haven't really I haven't picked it up yet. I do see a lot of comments about like the journey
yes,
as being part of the epic. And I guess I don't disagree with that, except for it kind of depends, because I think one of the things that is in the Stormlight Archive is Sanderson changes the meaning of journey. Whereas in The Lord of the Rings, it's a very literal, we're going from Hobbiton to Rivendell to Mordor. And we're going to stop in all these other places along the way. Whereas when you get to like the Stormlight Archive, it's like, well, yes, they do go to the Shattered Plains, to other places, but it's not like they go on road trips, but they aren't on one continuous road trip. And the journey is more of the metaphor of like life and growing up and living.
Yeah.
So,
you know what seems to come with that journey is that there's a fellowship that's involved. It's like that with just about all of them. I don't know if there's an epic fantasy where one person goes on a long journey without any assistance, but I don't know if that might be specifically Tolkien with the fellowship thing, because like I said, in the Dark Tower series, there is the quartet rather than the fellowship that are questing with the gunslinger, who would probably be Frodo, to the Dark Tower. It's a quintessential journey story like that. I think that the Wheel of Time is probably something along those lines. I'll tell you what's different about the Malazan Book of the Fallen. Now something that's hard for many people with this is that many people that have read it will tell you that you've got to get through the first 3 books entirely before you can see what this journey is all about and what's going on. And that's quite a bit of reading. They're long books. The second one's nearly 1,000 pages. The first one is close to 700. But that's probably one reason why I got burned out on the second book. I was just not sure what in the world was happening in this thing. There were a variety of different characters going about these different missions in a really long kind of way. I just couldn't figure out what was going on. But you see that too as well, I'm sure, that there's almost like always a fellowship involved with this.
yeah, the Wheel of Time has like the Emond's Field 5, but I guess one of my standing disagreements with Robert Jordan is that like it's about those 5 characters, but it's like also specifically how it's about how bad they are at keeping fellowship. And that's like a plot point that he decided to do. And so I'm waiting for them to start acting like they have fellowship with each other, because why else are we following them around? And all signs indicate that they need to come together to save the world, but they're like really bad at doing that. So, it's funny because like, and then Sanderson, I think, also plays with that as well, of like having the characters who are all needed, but unlike The Lord of the Rings, they're not necessarily like, it's going to be more like the Two Towers, where they're all off on their separate quests and then they come back together. That saves the world, as opposed to like them traveling together exclusively is what saves the world. Like there's the group, the separation, and then the reunion. And
yes, that is true.
And it seems like more modern, right, that I'm reading is more about the separation and then eventually, hopefully, the reunion.
Yeah. the Malazan Book of the Fallen is quite interesting. I think that the original 10 books in the Malazan Book of the Fallen has just a slightly higher word count than the entirety of the Wheel of Time series. What's interesting is this is a 10-book series, and there are an additional 3 books that are the prequel, and there's another author. Stephen Erickson writes the Malazan story, but there's another author, a friend of his, Isaac Esselmont, that authors stories in the same place in time that aren't directly part of this storyline, but they have influences on the storyline. So that's kind of interesting. Let me catch up with these comments here. Yeah, a great conflict or a war is almost always happening. There has to be some kind of great conflict or you don't have a story. Maria asks, I have the Dark Tower. Should I read them all in one go? And that would be a good idea. Something that's interesting with the Dark Tower series is that I actually do a video. If you look it up on here, I did a live stream some months ago about, with the Dark Tower series, many people have this recommended reading order where you read other King books amongst the series as you're going, because there are characters from seemingly standalone Stephen King books that come into the Dark Tower and play this big role. Randall Flagg is an example. He was in The Stand, one of the most popular novels of all time. He's a primary player in the Dark Tower series as well. So there are different recommended reading orders for that, but reading them in order without those other books would probably not be a bad idea. And check my video out if you want to see how some of those other books come into play. Let's go on with another question here. I assume I know the answer to this, but I'll ask you, which genre, which specific type of epic fantasy is your particular favorite?
I mean, I always thought of, I guess, I kind of want to hear your answer to that first, because I always thought of epic fantasy genre as like the genre on, like it's its own genre. So I guess, what do you mean by that question?
Well, I guess the dividing line that I would see most clearly would be the difference between high end and low end fantasy. Like with the Dark Tower series, there is a fantasy landscape called Midworld that they're in for part of it, but they're also in New York City in different time periods of New York City because there's time travel involved. And it can be somewhat based in our world with humans as the main characters for the most part, as where a high-end epic fantasy would like specifically take place completely outside of our world with maybe a whole different laws of physics and everything else. And Stephen King's The Dark Tower series is a low-end epic where they spend a lot of time in our world as well. And that's like, you would never see New York City come up in the Stormlight Archive, right? It's completely separated from our world. So perhaps you haven't even read any low-end epic fantasy, but I was just curious what your thoughts were like as far as the difference of those go.
I mean, I did try the Dresden Files, and
that's a perfect example of a low-end type series.
Like my objections with that was mostly just that I found Harry Dresden to be so annoying. Like there's like there's the male gaze, and then there's like whatever Harry Dresden is doing, and that's like somehow even worse. And so it's like, it wasn't the low end fantasy that part of it that annoyed me. I guess there's like a children middle grade of So You Want to Be a Wizard that is also takes place in New York City, or the Percy Jackson series it's like Harry Potter, except for it's set in the US and they're children of the gods and they go to a summer camp, but they do Greek quests throughout modern United States.
Yeah.
Or Europe in their secondary series. And like, I like those. I like trying to figure out like, oh, how would that fit in? How would what would a wood sprite do on her vacation in Hawaii or whatever? And I like that. But there is a part of me that still I'm just a sucker for a well-drawn world map. And the feeling of like I don't have to worry, like gravity is a thing, but they can mess with it here, and like the trees can grow golden apples, like that's fine. They don't have to explain that to me as in a deep epic fantasy, unlike if they showed up as in New York with the golden apples. Like, okay, how'd you get those? And I would love to read the explanation, but there's something very freeing about like just being in a completely new world.
Yeah. There is a such thing, I think, is probably, I'm going to kind of define this as epic fantasy in a way, but it's really a horror, most people would say. Are you familiar at all with The Vampire Chronicles by Anne Rice?
I am not. My depth of vampires is Sparkly Edward Cullen, and then The Vampire Diaries, the first book that sparked the CW show. So,
yeah, that's a really interesting series. I'm not sure if I would call it epic fantasy, but it really has an epic fantasy type feel to it, the way each book continues like the plot line that's going on, and there's a lot of different characters and a lot of different places. It has an epic kind of feel like that. And another one that I'll mention that's not technically epic fantasy, but it has a very similar feel is this one. It's the Earth's Children series by Jean Auel. The first one is The Clan of the Cave Bear. I'm guessing that you probably haven't heard of that one. Am I right?
I haven't even heard of that.
It's crazy, man. Look, it's a 6-book series. So it would fit my idea of epic. And it's a prehistoric series, technically. It's about this little girl. It's back when Neanderthals roamed the earth along with Homo sapiens, Cro-Magnons and whatnot, pre-human type peoples. And there's this little Cro-Magnon girl, basically a modern human named Ayla. And there's an earthquake as the novel opens up, and she's separated from her Cro-Magnon family. And some Neanderthals rescue her, and they take her with them to their cave to live with them. And she's like more beautiful than they are. She's smarter than they are. She's more evolved than they are. And most of them don't like her because of that. But it's this huge sprawling plot over 6 books. And it just has, like, it isn't epic fantasy. It's prehistoric fiction, but I think there's a high likelihood if somebody likes epic fantasy that they might also like that book. Let me ask you this. Are you into science fiction at all, or are you not into that?
I read Dune.
Yeah.
And like, that's about it. I'm trying, like, I know there's a lot of overlap, and I want to give the new Christopher Paolini book a try, but I think like I like technical explanations, but I generally find that overly technical explanations that are found in science fiction takes the fun out of it for me. Like, because it's just so serious all the time, or maybe that was just Dune. And like the lighter side of like I talked earlier about how Rowling is too much whimsy, but it's like I like a bit of whimsy in my world. I don't want everything to be straight lines and like Spock with like pure logic. It's like, that's a bit much.
Let's go through a few of these questions here. Trish said she just started the Dresden Files, loving it so far. You know, I like the Dresden Files. There's something that I would say about the Dresden Files, though, that I would probably consider maybe not necessarily epic fantasy, even on the low end, because what I picture with an epic fantasy series is just one plot that we're working through. I know with a game, with the Song of Ice and Fire, there are books like this. Fire and Blood by George R.R. Martin. This is like a side tale that doesn't cover the main plot line, but there's got to be that main plot line that's just like from one book to the next. It's the same damn story. One book can just completely cut off, and the next one picks up right where the other one left off. That's kind of what I'm picturing with one long tail. However, with the Dresden Files, each book is like a new case that he's investigating. However, there are things that carry over from one novel to the next, but I just don't think the format is exactly right on to call it a low-end epic fantasy story, because there's quite a bit of focus on each novel presents a new problem rather than one problem all the way through the story. But yeah, if you like a good detective mystery, I recommend. Okay, let me go down here. But yeah, the Dresden Files, I recommend it nonetheless. I'm going into book 5. You know, we should probably mention Harry Potter, because you mentioned that. You know, I'm in Potter book. I finished Potter book 3, and I know this is something that people either frown on Harry Potter and they say that's not good epic fantasy reading, or people really love that story. And I actually find that I'm quite partial to the Harry Potter series, being 3 books into it now. I think it's quite a good story. Some would argue it's the greatest story that's ever been written. What do you think about Harry Potter?
Oh, I wouldn't call it the greatest story that's ever been written. But I do think that it is a great introduction. Like, the first 2 books are easy reads. Although rereading the second one, I was like, I did not realize how horrifying this book just straight up is. It's like there's the equivalent of it, like this, there's like the magic serial killer is at large in the castle. And then the premise of the third book is a magic killer is also at large.
Yeah.
And the Ministry cares about that one. But not so much the first. And like there's the question of is like, yeah, how it's very middle grade that it has to be centered around Hogwarts Castle. Yeah. And eventually the whole Wizarding world is brought into it. And it's like very like contrived that it's like, oh, it all comes back to the castle. And so like those are like the conceits that like that's just the nature of the genre, that yes, it's about wizarding school, but it's like I love it. Sirius Black was like my godfather growing up. Like he was just so cool. Spoiler alert for people who haven't read the third book. And it was very sad, and like, but like as a whole like series, I haven't felt the need to like go back and reread the books over and over again since like if in a number of years, whereas other stories just have much more staying power that makes me like, oh, it's summer, time for me to read Lord of the Rings. Like, that's how I feel about that series.
Harry Potter is a great story. You know, I was surprised at how much I enjoyed that. It's been a while now since I finished the third book. I need to move on with that and see how it ends. You know, I wouldn't think of that when I think of epic fantasy, but it is a great story that usually comes up in these kinds of conversations. I really think it is a good story. I'm curious about how it ends, so I've got to get to the final book. Connor, I would say in the comments that the 3 books that actually 4 books that I would read. You should actually read 5 books before you get into like the 5th book of the Dark Tower series. The Stand, Insomnia, Black House, Hearts in Atlantis, and Salem's Lot. I would recommend with that one. But couple more things here. Oh, I want to finish my thought on that science fiction thing. There is no science fiction equivalent of The Lord of the Rings. Like The Lord of the Rings was the real beginning of the modern fantasy genre. Without that, we probably wouldn't even have it. I also like that same kind of sprawling plot idea played out in a science fiction landscape. Some people would say that Star Wars would be the equivalent of The Lord of the Rings. However, Star Wars wasn't a novel. So there isn't really anything like that. And I know that space opera is not as big as epic fantasy is, but I really like this Alastair Reynolds. He's an astronomer that writes something very similar to like the Stormlight Archive, but it's just deep space opera stuff. And it is very technical with like complex technical ideas and everything, but I really like that stuff as well. But anyway, we've made it for an hour. So I guess what we can do here to finish up, and I'll let you go last, I guess I'll summarize my thoughts on what my plans are for epic fantasy in the future. You know, I read the Dark Tower series and I loved it. And it was kind of like on a whim that I read that. And I'm fortunate that I did, because I have an idea of what that type of reading experience is now. And I've struggled a bit with some series, but I think as time goes on now, I'm more into the genre. Years ago, I tried to read like the Malazan Book of the Fallen. I couldn't get very far, but I think that I've just come to enjoy it more over time. So I have high hopes for going into that a second time and actually completing it. But I want to finish Oathbringer by Brandon Sanderson and Warbreaker by Brandon Sanderson. I've got to become caught up to date with that series. I really like that Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. It's unlike anything that I've ever read before. It makes me want to read more of him. But I also think that in the near future, I want to start over with a Game of Thrones. I actually might read Fire and Blood first, just to change it up, because I know you don't have to read this in chronological order. But as far as my reading projects for the future, I want to reread a Game of Thrones and read the entire Song of Ice and Fire. Hopefully Martin gets that next book out there soon. Yeah, and I also have to go back into the Malazan Book of the Fallen, which is going to be huge. It's going to be a huge series. I've got to reread the Gardens of the Moon and stick in there this time through that second book so that I can come out the other end of the first 3 books and finish that series. But that's basically what I've got going on as far as what I plan on reading in the near future. How about you? What are your plans for epic fantasy in the near future? I'll give you the last word here.
Well, I've got over the next, how many, 10 months? I think that adds up, finishing The Wheel of Time. I just read, and I'm going to do a review on The Lies of Locke Lamora, which I don't know if it's definitely fantasy, but it's not an epic. It seems, I've only read 1 book, but it seems like that was pretty much 1 episode, and then the next book is its own episode. And I don't know if I can, and I don't know if I can squeeze another epic fantasy series until I'm done with Wheel of Time, and then it would probably either be Malazan or Dark Tower, just because, not only because of your enthusiastic recommendations, but because those seem like good places to fill in. So one of those 2, and then I'm always looking for like one-off fantasy books to fill to as light hors d'oeuvres in between like the heavy epic entries. You seem to be very like, take a book here, take a book there. It's like, I'm like, once I start a series, either I finish it or I drop it entirely. Like, I can't like pick up a series and then like put it down and then come back later. So it's a commitment.